Good morning. Welcome to Madrid platform. It's 10 o'clock in the morning here in Madrid. Welcome to you from all over the world who are watching us on streaming. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. This is day 2 of 3 with a very complete agenda today, and we'll be collaborating. And there's more than 500 companies, 3,500 participants can really get the tools, learn of the trends so that their businesses grow on both sides of the Atlantic. Thanks for those who are here in person. Remember that we have all the anti-COVID measures in place. We'll be following all of these safety protocols to make this a safe place. And also I'd like to thank the Town Hall of Madrid and all of the companies who have made this act possible. Now we have a seminar, an international seminar of companies in crisis. We're going to talk about restructuring and refinancing of companies. And for that, we have with us today Pedro Martín Molina. He's from the CEO of Martín Molina Lawyers and Economists. Good morning. And also we have Enrique Diez Reborio. He's a lawyer in the Justice Administration, and he's also the director of the Bankruptcy Law Department at IAG Auction. We have Antonio Magraner, president of FIGE, which is the Federation of Young Entrepreneurs in Latin America. We're going to be here now from see a video of the restructuring department in Latin America with an international focus on different sectors formed by experts with synergies in knowledge between Spain and Latin America, contributing solutions for companies and generating a new business future. IBER, the Latin American Institute of Restructuring and Refinancing. Good morning. Good morning to everyone. I'm going to take the mask off to speak. Another presentation in this symposium where we're going to propose a tool that was created, or that's going to be created, to use the tools, restructuring tools that have been developed either due to the pandemic or due to the economic crisis, the cyclical economic crisis that we have suffered. But the presentation will be for the second part of the presentation. I think that would make more sense. And we're going to start now and delve deeper into this topic. We're going to begin today's session talking about restructuring. We'll start with the definition of what restructuring is. If we speak about accounting, then we'll have to say what accounting is, and then we'll talk about the best tools and so forth to do that. I've prepared a few PowerPoint slides that I'll refer to. And I'd like to... Restructuring means reorganizing. It could be a liquidation, orderly liquidation. It also could be a divestment of the company. But restructuring then, a restructuring plan, has a series of things but you have to know the environment of the company and apply these. There are periods where we have bonanza and periods of crisis and periods of... In periods of bonanza, we have a better competitive position. We can expand, which might be the case of going beyond the borders of Spain to Latin America, for example, or the other way around from Latin America to Spain. And when we are in a crisis, then there's fear of the possibility of not being able to get back on your feet. So you have to be able to deal with these, address these crises. So there needs to be a thorough control of how to get out of a crisis. We can't sit back and feel sorry for ourselves when we're in a crisis. We have to plan for crises, and we have to know and have a few things in mind to be able to foresee the crisis. I like to stand up when I make my presentation. That's something I learned after 30 years of teaching at the university. This chair is useful sometimes, but I like to stand up to make my presentations. Now, this crisis could be global, it could be a sectoral, it could be a crisis of the company. But crises need to be, we have to look at them by sector. We have to identify the sector of the crisis. We need to reorganize the company. We need to update the treasury, restructure costs. There are so many things to do in a time of crisis that really does create a bit of fear. And the moment of truth arrives, and the crisis, as the Chinese say, crisis means danger, and for others it means an opportunity. Let's talk at the opportunity. Yesterday, when we presented the International Entrepreneurship Observatory, we talked about this, that there are challenges, and we have to look at the threats and opportunities. If there are threats, then we stay at home and we'll never solve anything. So we have to address these, at least try to address these fears with the best tools, of course. Now, this difficult decision needs to be taken by people, by the board of the company, and they have to know how to react to a crisis. They know how to deal with the situation. They look for an external team, possibly. They maybe remove the management team that they have. These are important decisions, but crisis means to work fast. If you go slow, that means catastrophe. So you need to work fast. So in a crisis, we could find a situation where you don't do anything. You sell everything. I feel desperate. Now, restructuring, sometimes it can have no end. It can go on and on. So we have to look at the long-term feasibility, positive cash flow, with sales results that are growing, better production. But they have to be decisions taken by the directors. They have to agree. They shouldn't be individual decisions. We have to find financing. The financing needs to be, especially those bridge financing needs to be found. A way to obtain that liquidity that is needed to be able to address the challenge. And we need motivation. You can't sit down and cry. You have to look for some quick wins. You have to feel like winners to be able to overcome a crisis. So these benefits that we can get from a restructuring, there could be more benefits than detractions, really. Why? Because first of all, we maintain the company's patrimony. If all of the patrimony remains together, then all of the financial costs could go very high. We need to segregate these patrimonies, and this can also help us to finance operations. So we divide risk. It's important also to know what business lines, what part of the company is profitable and what part is not profitable, what assets are unnecessary and what are necessary. We have to do this in an orderly fashion, as we'll see in the next talk. So we have a whole guide of best practices that comes from the European Union on this. We can see that we need to control the cost of the operation. We need to optimize resources. We need to align the structure of the organization with the definition of the company and what it wants to do. And there are different stages to all of this. And I'm going to talk a little bit more to this. This is these can overlap. It's not like these stages go one consecutively, one after another. So it could be some overlapping here, and some could take as long as 2 or 3 years. I'm going to adjust my microphone here. I'm not an expert. So in these different stages that we see here, we're going to, the first stage is the change of the management team. We cannot continue with the same team that wasn't able to identify that crisis was coming, or the pre-crisis, that didn't take action in time. Maybe there was a rigid bureaucratic decision-taking process. Maybe they feared the uncertainty that was coming, so we need a new management team. We'll lose the knowledge of the old company, but we'll have the strength of a new management team for the financial restructuring. We'll have a team that is not afraid of the stress caused by a crisis. There will be professionals that will objectively decide what to do with the company. And then we get into the evaluation. Now, evaluation, what does that mean? We're going to do a feasibility analysis, and we're going to take decisions, short-term decisions, actions, quick actions. And to do that, we need to know what the problem is. What is my problem? I don't have financing, maybe. Maybe I'm being strangled by lack of funds, or maybe my market is no longer being able to make sales. So we do this feasibility study. We need to use segmentation techniques. And here we have a figure that we'll talk about at the end of my presentation, about some partial decisions that need to be taken to segment my company and to adjust to the market. We need to look at what available resources we have. If we need solvency, and whether we have human capital and so forth, we need to see what our resources are. We're going to use two terms that are in the European directive. They talk about the financial and operational actions. These are terms, homogeneous terms that are used. Operation is direct action of the company, controlling costs, controlling the treasury, analyzing, implementing new competitive process, and financial is a matter of seeking new financing, new liquidity, fresh money that's needed to renegotiate the terms with our old shareholders. This operational restructuring has 5 points that we need to carry out. The first is define the strategic objectives of the mission core business. What is the mission of my company? That's going to define the objectives that I want to achieve. If I don't know what the mission is, then I don't know what the objectives are. Let's talk about Don Algodón, that was started to make T-shirts and now makes perfume. If these T-shirts, or if they got over-indebted, I needed to know what market is the traditional T-shirt market or the perfume market. I needed to decide, and maybe needed to divide my company then and move in one direction or the other. That's why it's very important to define those strategic objectives. The second part would be the strategic alignment. In other words, what do we want to achieve? What organizational structure do we need to be able, over a short period of time, to take immediate short-term actions? We have to work fast. We're not talking about long-term feasibility here, these success factors that we're seeking over the long term, but we need to work in the short term. And resizing. It seems like we're going to grow here. No, this means adapting my company to the opportunities that exist. In other words, maybe reduce the size of the company, make it feasible. I think this is the most important aspect of an operational restructuring. These are 5 actions. The organizational structure And then we also have the acquisition or divestment policy of non-current assets. What is strategic, what are we going to use, and what is unnecessary? We also do need to look at profitability analysis. During this evaluation, we need liquidity, and maybe in another time we need more payment from customers than profitability from a partner. We need, and that's an important policy, is the provisioning policy. We can't have all of our liquidity in a warehouse. We have to have these stocks depending on real sales, real potential sales, and control our operational costs. This means staff, necessary expenses to obtain revenues. We have to analyze all of that, get some feedback, and see the pros and cons of the decisions that we're going to take. The fourth point, which is controlling the treasury and optimizing resources, there's a thorough plan, treasury plan, that up until now maybe has not been done, and maybe things have gotten out of control with the treasury. Where? Well, in those investments that were not profitable, or those expenses that we could have contained, possibly. And then we need to contain expenses. And then management control will be the fifth point. We have everything, the first 4 points analyzed. Now we're going to control the management, the integral management of the company. And this has to be done by the new management team. Each one of the decisions taken with the approval of the board has to see that those different areas are working with this with the new strategy and this new liquidity. Therefore, the European directive is supporting all of these actions. Restructuring has always existed, and we've always had restructuring plans, but now we have to adapt it to the crisis situation in each one of the countries, in Spain and in Latin America. The emergency or crisis phase. Now comes the time for a decision. We need to reevaluate the business model. We have to start up sales again. We have to rechannel things over the short term. Stay with those lines of business that are really profitable. Now we need to analyze the products and those business lines of business we need to divest, maybe refinance. All of this, what does that mean? This means having a competent team to do all of this. Cash is king. We need liquidity, which could be through divestment. Divestment will bring immediate liquidity by controlling the sales sold with certain terms, so we have to maybe shorten those payment terms and so forth. And so all of that treasury management has to work to aid profitability, to get over the financial difficulties that we're encountering. Now, within that emergency, we have the financial management. We talked about this yesterday. Financial management means refinancing debt. How do we do that? We could go to basic refinancing, in other words, money from partners, or to bring in new partners as long as they're accepted by the old partners. How is this going to, all the different ways that this contribution can be made, but it's not just from partners, either new or old partners. It has to be accompanied, this refinancing, with a banking institution. It has to be a joint type of financing. The banking institution needs to see this business model. And there are other alternatives that we mentioned yesterday, other types of financing. We have here different alternatives like crowdfunding, venture capital, crowd lending, and crowd factoring. At the end of the day, these are investment funds, private investment. In other words, private money looking for new business models that create this restructuring of the company, this geographical implementation or the development of new products or old products, and focusing with money. Some will be looking for profitability in a certain percentage. Others will act as a bank. And others will be a discount of online invoices and so forth. In this financial management, we have the explanation of each one of these, and we also have to make estimates and provisions. What variables will I use to estimate over the medium term so that those forecasts are realistic? I have to see what variables I need to look at. What impact will what I think I will have in revenues and payments is going to determine the time horizon that I have to establish. In these forecasts, there's three parts. We have operational decisions, financial decisions, and tactical decisions. The first are pretty clear because but what does tactical decisions mean? All of those estimates and forecasts need to be tactical. The market, sector, realistic terms, implementation in the market of the new business model, digital marketing, digitization. These are all tactics that go together with these forecasts. Analysis of cost or reduction of cost. This is a reorganization. Reducing cost means reorganizing. That's part of the restructuring, really. We have the operational costs, financial costs. There we have to be very careful and to not get too much into debt. At a time of restructuring, and we'll see that in the second part of this seminar, there are situations where even if the company is profitable, when I create a new model, the volume of financing might not be feasible. How can I change and turn that around? And then we see the different alternatives. We have new tools that are they're coming out in a new directive that's going to come out with a new bankruptcy law. And in the second part of the presentation, we did an analysis with some countries in Latin America about these new types of tools. And we have new workers coming in as well. These are communication mechanisms in a new business line. We need to transfer all of this to the staff because it's the staff. People are people, and we're working with people. Those people have families, and we have to know that reorganizing our business means that they could have a shorter work day. So it's going to affect our staff. The crisis in Spain created uncertainty, but the workers are the key part of our company. So all this analysis is good, but the person that has the know-how is the worker. So restructure has to include workers. I'm not going to talk about tax restructuring because that would just take too long. But then we finally reach stability. That doesn't mean that you're safe yet, but at least that you can start to think over the medium term. I have the tools. I've decided to take a decision. I have cash flow. Now I have to focus on the rates and come up with a good payment policy to bring in the money. And now we're starting to increase margins. This could be volume, this could be a price war, it could be orders, the way we implement in the market, the capital invested. How can I justify to my shareholders and the board the capital employed? And if we go, once we get to past stability, then we start to grow. Where do we grow? Well, we grow where we wanted to grow. We started with a problem, we solved the problem, and now we're going to grow again. But we're not going to fall into the same pitfall as before. We need to focus on the areas and develop those areas in an orderly fashion. We have to establish protocols of action. We have to have a new type of marketing, maybe with a new name, with a new brand, with a new positioning, use digitization in these cases. So now we can begin to talk about return on investment at this stage. And now just to finish up, we don't always achieve the correct financing for the restructuring. I'm just going to say just a few more things. I'm going to give the floor to Enrique. Sorry, I'm going on too long. I get very excited when I start talking about all of this. I encourage you for 2022 to come to Madrid, and we'll invite you to come and have tapas and beer to continue to talk about all of these things, and good wine, of course. We can invest in wineries in Spain if you would like. And that's what we want with the Institute, to set up these ties, these links with Latin America. So there are sometimes failures. There could be poor management. There could be insufficient funds, a strategy, an incorrect strategy. If we go back to that algodón example, they decided to go in the direction of perfumes, and that was the correct strategy. But if it had failed, then that would have been the wrong strategy. So if you take the risk and it works, well, that's great. And if it doesn't, well, then it could fail. The restructuring could fail. And divestment strategies, and mergers, the sale of production units. In other words, get rid of some assets. This is just a summary. The integral restructuring plan. We're familiar with this. We have the business plan, all breaking down of how it should look. All business plan and feasibility plan forming part of the restructuring. I think it needs to go hand in hand with an analysis, a quantitative and qualitative analysis of the restructuring, because we'll see later. Oh, I actually have it right here. We'll see that we're reaching a moment when the economic instruments can no longer measure this distance with the pre-bankruptcy. We have algorithms that, through the annual accounts and other variables of the P&L, we can see when we're going to reach solvency again. And we'll talk about that in a later presentation. And I just also wanted to mention the legal restructuring. That hasn't been studied in Spain in the bankruptcy law. There's a lacuna here. Can we do mergers? Can we have spin-offs? There's a lacuna here. Now, within that framework, why can't we merge stronger companies and get a good restructuring plan under our bankruptcy law? Save companies, but to reach bankruptcy, we'd have to first have a restructuring, knowing what we wanted to do, negotiate with the banking institutions. That's the reality. Now, just to finish up, this is what I like the most, which is we're going to create a figure, the IBER monitor. Now, what is that? This is a key part. This is the structure for companies looking towards the pre-crisis and knowing this bankruptcy law. In this study done with other countries, there are some countries more ahead than others. We can create best practices, a figure that knowing the whole legal structure of Latin America and Spain can unify procedures to be able come up with restructuring agreements and have address all of these situations homogeneously. So we want to establish organic statutes and a study to come up with this IBER monitor. Now I'm going to stop there and give the floor to my good friend Enrique, and I hope that I didn't tire you out too much. Enrique now is going to talk.
Thank you. Thank you for such an interesting talk. The economic part has been explained brilliantly by Pedro, so I cannot contribute to that. So I will just tell you a story. The story of the frog that was boiled in water. It comes from a French guy who was a physician. It is the human response to sicknesses that does not hurt. If you fall down and you break your foot, you go straight to the hospital. But if you have a high level of cholesterol, you just forget about it, don't think about it. Till one day your level is really high and you try to act, but it's too late. When you boil a frog, the same thing happens. If you put a frog in boiling water, as soon as the frog touches the boiling water with its foot, it jumps away. But if you put the frog into a nice water with a nice temperature, the frog feels all right. So the frog stays there, and when the water begins to boil, the frog cannot leave and is trapped in the boiling water. The same thing can apply to a company. If we want to provide a solution to our company, we have to realize that the water is getting warmer and warmer, because when the water is too hot, when the water is boiling, there is nothing else to do, and our company will be bankrupt. So we have to prevent that from happening. And therefore, we have several tools in our yearly accounting, for example. But when do we need to carry out the restructuring? When do we have to do that? Because that has to be a solution. We do not have to wait till it's too late. When the water is boiling, as I said before, there is nothing to do. We have to save the company while the water is not so hot. We can perhaps see that our results are not good enough anymore. And then, in that case, we have to see if the company has an appropriate size. Perhaps during a period of bonanza, we grew too much, and we have our fixed costs are too high, and we can't cope with those costs anymore. And therefore, if we consider the economic results during the pandemic and the medical situation, we have to think as follows. Is my company profitable, and now we are going through a crisis due to the pandemic? For example, a restaurant. A restaurant might not be having good results, perhaps because of the restrictions, and then restaurants have had to shut down, and now my company, my restaurant, is not viable right now. If there weren't a pandemic, would my restaurant be profitable? And that is what I need to do. Which are my fixed costs? Do I really need to own the real estate? A good formula for restructuring that is being applied in Spain, especially in hotels, is doing the following: selling the real estate and being able to use the facilities, because perhaps my performance is not good enough, and perhaps I have assets that I do not need. I need to know my assets and my liabilities. Where are my liabilities? Are my liabilities due to a high level of expenditure? Did I invest too much? I need to know all this well in advance, before the water boils, as I said before. I might be able to sign a contract and sell my real estate and then pay a rent and use the property. We have to consider that the interest rates, the European Bank is nearly 0%. So if the new owner of the real estate gets a 4%, that would be good for him or her. So I can only do this operation if it is feasible. So we need to analyze the situation in time. When the water is not boiling yet, we have to know why we are not solvent anymore. So once I know that I have a problem, I have to adopt a solution, because perhaps I was making ice cubes in the North Pole, so that is not a profitable business, and therefore that company cannot be restructured. That company was just a bad idea, a bad business idea. But that is not very common. The common thing is that usually, if we act in time, we can save the company, we can restructure the company. We can see if there is an operational problem or if there is a financial problem. And depending on the cause of the problem, we will adopt different decisions and carry out a restructuring plan in time. Companies can very often be saved, especially if we begin to restructure in due time. If we wait too long, it will probably be too late. So we have to act in time, as I said before, when our cholesterol level is not so high. So I will give the floor to my colleague. I'm sorry, I apologize for being late, but I had a medical appointment. I'll use your tool. I will be late as you next time. Yes, I got my crunch in order for people to open doors for me. So I will probably use it for a long time. Thank you. Thank you. He's one of the guys supporting IBER. FIGE, that is the Ibero-American Association of Young Entrepreneurs. It's kind of a bridge between Latin America and ourselves, because we have to have a dialogue with older people as well as with younger people. We are setting up this foundation, and our colleague will talk about some concerns regarding restructuring of companies. Well, yes, I'm very thankful for this invitation to be here with you. I would also like to thank you for the observatory and for the institute you've launched. Alfonso mentioned it, and the whole team of the AGE, the Spanish Confederation of Young Entrepreneurs, which is part of FIGE, all of us really liked your ideas, especially because the world is more and more interconnected in many different ways. And little by little, we are realizing how fortunate we are here in Spain and in Latin America, because our region is made of 750 million people. We have a common culture. We have a common origin. When you travel throughout Latin America, they feel very proud of Spain. The fathers and the grandfathers and grandmothers were Spanish. And therefore, I think it is important that we go also to other regions, but a natural leap when you want to internationalize companies, both SMEs or big companies, is to go to Latin America. Anglo-Saxon people have done that very well through the Commonwealth, and we are doing the same with Latin America, and we have a huge opportunity right now thanks to the current connectivity we enjoy nowadays. The world is more and more interconnected right now, which is very good for all of us. And your idea of the observatory is a key pillar of our work, because thanks to the observatory, we will see what's happening in Latin America and what will come to Spain, and the other way around. In terms of export and import, we will see that the first impact will be in Latin America. And I was talking to Maroto the other day, and the U.S. has a huge impact in Latin America. And then in second place, Spain. After the U.S., Spain has more import and export with Latin American countries and the rest of the European Union countries. And therefore, we have to continue to increase our bonds between both regions, the same way you yourselves are doing. Thank you. Thank you for your commitment. The foundation is for middle-sized companies. SMEs need more protection because bigger companies play a leading role. They have big law firms that protect them. Rodriguez and others are talking about more and more mergers. The foundation is a good idea. We started to think about the foundation during lockdown, and the idea was to go hand in hand with companies to help professionals. We at the foundation do not want to implement anything. We just want to help other people to adopt different criteria that can be useful for them, such as in the case of preventive restructuring, second chance for businesses. So we should have the same criteria here in Spain and in Latin America. We should have a common framework, because anyone can sell a production unit, a company that is expanding from Mexico to Spain, and the foundation wants to be able to draft protocols, talking to professionals, in this case from Mexico and from Spain, and we can also export know-how to Latin America. That is what the foundation can do, generate wealth. The industrial fabric is made of middle-sized companies, individuals that set up a small company, and then that company becomes an empire sometimes. And that is the core activity of the foundation. Sorry for interrupting you, Pedro, but following what you just said, I think you took the right decision. The best thing is preventive medicine. It's the same for companies. You need to know what is about to happen. I think your approach is right, because big corporations already have in-house departments, so they do not need a foundation such as yours. Thanks to digitalization, you have more opportunities. And SMEs can be competitive as compared to big corporations, but their budget will never be big enough in order to have such advisors and departments in-house, and therefore the Institute and the Foundation are absolutely key in order to help SMEs. We need small and medium-sized companies need you much more than big corporations. We will have a presentation for the media in a few months with Pedro and through the institution and the Council of Ibero-American Entrepreneurs with the 23 employers organizations in Latin America. We are all working in a very ambitious project with the different governments in Latin America, because we have a huge potential there. But there is a lot of inequality, socially and economically speaking, in Latin America, and that inequality is because the economy is not formal. It is not underground economy. It is just informal in economy, not underground economy. It's people that live on a daily basis. I mean, people who work in the morning in order to have lunch and then work in the afternoon in order to have dinner. So we at both organizations, together with Pedro and his team, are working with Latin American governments in order to channel this informal economy and to restructure it so that governments know what is going on. It's going to be good for everyone. So we are trying to convince, to persuade these informal entrepreneurs to start working in a more formal manner, because that is good for everyone. They will have social security and the government will get income as well. So this is just an example of having a preventative approach. This is something that is working in Europe and that can be adapted to the Latin American region. That is a beautiful project indeed, something we will analyze and implement. I'm older than you, so who knows if I will be able to see it with my own eyes. Yes, you will see it. Because you are working very enthusiastically, and so are we, and therefore the project will be a reality very soon. So Belén, let's hope we all see that project implemented. Pedro and Enrique, thank you very much for talking to us about how to restructure companies. Now, as you know, we need 3 minutes to follow the COVID protocol, and we have the dialogue going on through the hashtag Madrid platform. So please share your ideas and thoughts with those of us who cannot be in this room with us. Thank you very much.
Good morning, good evening. You might be just getting up in Latin America. This second part of this seminar on restructuring of companies in crisis and refinancing. We have here now the panel discussion, and I'll just make a small presentation as the moderator to initiate the debate with the two people with me today. Let me introduce them first. These are very good friends of mine, both of them. We have two people with a great reputation and ideal people professionally. They have a tremendous capacity for study and work. They're envy of many people. Enrique, we know he works at the Ministry of Justice. He's written books about the things that we're going to talk about. And then César Juárez, he's a judge at the Commercial Court in Tarragona. And that he's been observing this situation in the courts. The judge needs to know the procedure, needs to know the situation and apply the law, but he has to look beyond the world, the commercial world. He has to understand companies too. That's what sets him apart from other judges. And then we're going to get into the discussion. And this will be just the start of what we're going to talk about. These slides we're going to show now. And it's just the start of the content of this union with Latin America. So here we're going to be talking about Spain and these tools and the insolvency law and restructuring, but we're going to see what the European directive says, just very briefly. You have all of these slides already. And we're going to compare now how the situation is in Mexico, Peru, Chile, for example, and this will be food for the debate. We have colleagues from those countries that could talk about this, but we'll look at what the directive says, how it's going to be implemented in Spain, and with that directive, how that can adapt to Latin America so that we have culture, we have protection, we have a way to do business. As you'll see, I'm going to stand up again. I can't see very well, so I need to go a little bit closer to the slide. What tools do we have in Spain? We have 4 tools. We have the creditor bankruptcy. We have a bankruptcy council that's formed. And then we have an agreement between the different creditors, or it could be a liquidation of the company. And second, we have refinancing agreements. These are bilateral and collective agreements, and each one has certain requirements. In all of these, there is protection for those that are going to go for the refinancing, or they can be standardized legally. And then we have mechanisms for the pre-bankruptcy. I think this is very beneficial. I did a doctoral thesis on this pre-bankruptcy law, and we're going to talk about that, of selling productive units, of the way to protect oneself from third parties to not get into bankruptcy. And then the out-of-court agreement on payments. So now, let's see what the European directive says. Well, this talks about 3 points that we're going to, and of these we'll talk about 2. The framework for the preventive restructuring, early detection, as Enrique talked about before. Don't let the water boil. We have to prevent, and prevention is the way to cure. And then we'll talk about the second chance, writing off debt. Now, given this situation, the directive talks about 4 different scenarios. Companies that is economically feasible and financially feasible, and it continues stable with no difficulties. The second case will be the unfeasible, inviable companies from an economic or financial point of view. So they need to be liquidated, and it says they should be liquidated as quickly as possible according to the directive. It doesn't say to try to make them profitable. No, they should be liquidated as quickly as possible. Now, the third case is those that are economically unviable, but they are viable financially. So not making enough to cover costs, including the financial costs. Have the current value of the company is negative. So if you owe more than you have, either you have to get refinancing or inject capital in some other way, or liquidate. And the fourth case would be the companies that are economically viable, but not viable from a financial point of view. So I have good economic margins. I have the possibility of expanding, but I don't have the finance to do it. So I do have, so the in debt, and the payment on that debt is strangling me. So therefore, we'd have to restructuring our liabilities. And here is a chart that shows when, it's not very clear. So the macro preventive restructuring, this is what we saw on the panel. Well, it defines restructuring here, and here you can see that it's a modification of the makeup of the conditions of the assets and liabilities of any debtor structure. And we have an article, and we have defined aspects of the preventive restructuring, the availability of using the restructuring framework. If the debtor has to be active in the restructuring, he can't be a passive. And second, facilitate negotiation in this restructuring framework, preventive restructuring. These restructuring plans that appear as the third point in this restructuring framework, or preventive restructuring framework, is that there is a minimum framework. We have that in the directive. So within this national legal framework, we can implement this restructuring plan. And within that restructuring plan, we have to assess the company. Up until now, they weren't assessed or evaluated. And there are certain effects of these restructuring plans. They have to link all of the different parts that form part, or that take decisions in that sense, and resources. Someone who has suffered damages can always get remedy through this process. That's what they call the forced restructuring applied to all of those that vote. And there you have the workers have a lot to say in this area. And we protect financing, and they talk about two types of financing, the old financing and the forced financing. And they're saying that the refinancing agreements are all well and good, but we have to look at the source. I have to look for alternative sources of financing. And there's a financing. I should have said provisional financing, not forced financing. And that we have that bridge financing that we taled about before to be able to maintain the viable lines of business. And debt exoneration, that's give companies a second chance. In Spain, the second chance, if we go to the courts, and you know this better than anyone, 1 in 1,000 might prosper. That second chance, it's true that if we prevent, we can exonerate the debt or write off the debt, but it's very, very difficult, more difficult than finding some other alternative. Chile uses this as well, but what framework does Chile have? Well, it has the reorganization of the indebted company, the reorganization in bankruptcy law. They have this simplified reorganization. So they do have a framework. Here they don't talk about pre-bankruptcy or whether it's developed or not. They also talk about the liquidation of the company and the shield that all companies should have. Let's go to Colombia. In Colombia, we have two procedures, the legal reorganization and the out-of-court agreements. And we have three new lines here, which is the abbreviated process and another two new processes. These are the result of COVID. They reacted very fast in Colombia. They believe in this creditors' bankruptcy plan. So I'm not going to get into any detail. In Mexico, for example, that's more similar to Spain. They go one step further together with this commercial bankruptcy process. They have the prepay. But each jurisdiction then would create these best practices for the procedure because there's really no standardization in Spain. And Mexico has taken a step there. Maybe we can learn from them, from what they're doing in standardizing this. Here we have, I'm going to finish up now with Peru. There are two types of procedures, the restructuring and the refinancing. Here, it's not the courts that take this, that deal with this. It's the competition, the competition authority rather than the courts. This is an autonomous government institution. And as in other cases, we have here the development of the different content, and there's a new procedure in Peru, which is the accelerated bankruptcy process. And given the lack of liquidity in the business, it provides an authority with the authority to renegotiate. Now we're going to get into the discussion. Since each one regulates under Roman law and a standard Roman law in each country, so that's a useful tool. The idea is to pay creditors and maintain the companies afloat. If we can get that one framework for Latin America, and why is that? Because my Mexican colleague said yesterday that there's a company in Mexico that sold a lot of bread, a company that had and that closed with the crisis. Now, why didn't we have this framework where Spanish companies could go and provide new financing so that make that company viable again? We have to look at the laws, the different laws in each one, given it's facing the same reality. I'm going to finish up with that and give the floor now to my two colleagues who have come to participate in, and let's hear what they have to say. Good morning. Thanks very much, Pedro. It's a pleasure to sail this panel with you. And my friend Enrique, thanks very much to the organizers at Madrid Platform. And this is a magnificent idea to have this symposium after many years. I think that the idea is fantastic. The idea here, we've often said that we should bring these two worlds together, the two worlds separated by the Atlantic Ocean, that have so many ties, social, cultural, and economic ties. I've always heard this idea that we need to get closer if we believe in improving the single markets, then there has to be a framework, a legal framework. But we're not talking so much about the positive aspects. I think everyone agrees that this should be done. But now we have to look at the current circumstances, dramatic circumstances, and the need for doing this, to bring these two worlds together. The economic crisis coming from the healthcare crisis of COVID-19. This needs to encourage all operators to create these stable frameworks over and above the sovereignty of each country, to bring our positions closer together in the economy and business, and the world of insolvency and business disease, let's say, how to solve it. Now we can talk about these different bankruptcy proceedings that many companies go out of business, they disappear, and we know the balances and the limitations of each one of our laws. The law in our case, the Spanish law that I'm familiar with. Each one of you in your different countries have your own regulatory framework, as Pedro just mentioned. But in Spain, I think we could make this extensive to all the countries. We've been undergoing, as a result of COVID, and I think this is the result of a long process, we really are undergoing a revolution, or an earthquake, I could say, in business solvency. You know that in the European Union, they've approved passed a directive. It has 3 different levels that Pedro talked about, 3 different levels to deal with insolvency from 3 different perspectives. Spain, as a member of the European Union, benefits from this common regulatory framework that it has to implement then in its laws. It has to be implemented by each of the countries. We right now in Spain, we're in this process of implementing the laws of the government now. The Spanish Parliament and many legal and economic operators right now are trying to implement the framework directives, adapting them to the uniqueness of each country within this context, which means that we have to go quite fast. So we're thinking now very quickly and trying to come up with a series of concepts which will be decisive over the next several months in Europe and in Spain and Latin America, in terms of providing all economic operators with a stable regulatory framework to deal with restructuring of companies. And so what comes out of these next couple months, we'll see this in the future. If we get the right solutions, we'll see the fruits of this, not only coming up with a beneficial solution for the situation, but to set the stage for future economic growth. My talk here is going to be very brief, so I can't get into the main lines of our insolvency law, but I would like to just talk about 3 or 4 little points. You know that in Spain, our regulatory situation, which is quite modern, our bankruptcy law, was implemented in 2004, and it was applauded by the business world because it unified a very dispersed regulations. And the bankruptcy law from 2003 was approved during economic bonanza. It was the instrument to deal with the very serious economic crisis in 2008, 2009, and since those initial moments where the law really had very little time in force, and so the limitation of the instruments offered by that bankruptcy law. 2003, 2004, that was relatively recent, but in terms of the evolution of insolvency, we can talk about, it's really an old law now, and that's happening, the same thing is happening now. We're in a different scenario. The crisis is different, and the characteristics are unique, which makes it quite different. And now we perceive that these old instruments aren't working anymore. So given the European regulations, we need to implement these new frameworks. First of all, and this is extremely important with everything that Pedro said in the first half of talking about the restructuring of debt, the refinancing, it's very important to develop a framework which is called the early alerts. Enrique also mentioned this, to identify difficult circumstances that companies may be facing. So the game here is played in the pre-insolvency stage, really. Where judges are often tired of being the funeral directors, because more than 90% of the bankruptcy proceedings in Spain are just result in liquidation, the end of the company. So we feel like funeral directors, and we'd like to change that situation. So circumstances often are that it's not possible to come to some kind of agreement with the creditors and have the company survive. So, like I said, most of these companies then are liquidated once they get into bankruptcy court, and the Spanish, Chilean, Colombian businessmen, I think this is common to all business people, they know the product that they sell or the service that they offer. They know the market that they're working in. They know their competitors, but they don't often have the instruments for this early warning so that they can take action before they reach the bankruptcy stage. In the European Union, the adaptation of the law to Spain, I think now there's certain changes that will need to be made over the next couple of months to our bankruptcy law to provide the instruments for these early warnings. The operational restructuring, financial restructuring that we talked about, and also this second part, the other side of the coin. In all of those cases where these instruments are not efficient and the company does have to go through a liquidation process, this also needs to be done in an orderly fashion, calling on institutions that will try to maybe we can sell off the productive units, the pre-pack, using maybe Anglo-Saxon law here, North American law. I can congratulate the Americans and the British because they've already incorporated this into their law. So we need to be able we need to be very agile in providing companies with quick instruments, liquidation instruments, and for the cases where there's not full satisfaction of all the creditors, which is in the immense majority of the cases, we also have to be able to get a fresh start, a way to give a second chance to companies, to people. The European directive, and I think in comparative law as well, it's also in Spain this happens, allows the possibility of a second chance, not only to companies but also to individuals and consumers. And also we have to be able to be more effective in the procedures. This is the third part of the directive. Here I refer to measures to improve the efficiency of the restructuring, solvency, and debt exoneration. Now, putting all of this together, This is an issue that we could be talking about for a very long time, but these institutions, these three pillars in the directive, if they're coordinated, if we are able to be agile and original and go past the spirit of the law and look for a complementary framework amongst the different countries, I think this could allow us, we at least hope, to get out of the crisis in a better condition and professionally. We know that there's no possibility of a market unless we have legal certainty. If we don't have a stable legal framework and it gives the correct response for everyone that are operating in that business world, then there's no possibility of operating an efficient market of goods and services. I'm going to finish there and give the floor to Enrique. Thanks very much.
Well, as Cesar mentioned, we have two problems in our bankruptcy law. We are talking about refinancing, about reaching agreements with creditors, and we are talking about pre-agreement, pre-bankruptcy. No, they should be called as institutes to avoid, to prevent. But this is a way to do things better. In most cases, when an entrepreneur needs to go for a bankruptcy agreement, they do it because they already need it. So the idea would be to turn to such institutes to avoid going bankrupt. When you read the prologue of the law, you said, well, there are so many good intentions. They say that there should always be a creditors' agreement between debtors and creditors, and only when there is no agreement, we will liquidate the company. So how can it be that 95% of companies that go to such a situation end up being bankrupt? Well, because we are too late. When I was a kid, I remember a song from Nicaragua about a cat that was lying on its back. The owner of the company doesn't think that the bankruptcy law will be helpful because, of course, now the pandemic has been used for many different things. So, for example, in Spain, the government approved certain regulations for bankruptcy situations. And also, financial aid was provided by Spanish central government and by regional governments. In order to receive aid, some requirements had to be fulfilled, some feasibility requirements. And that means that the government will only give you public aid if your company is viable. If the company is to be liquidated, then it is pointless to allocate public resources. So, when you had to call for the bankruptcy law, nobody said that there should be a moratorium for those companies that had an insolvency situation due to the COVID-19 crisis. But the situation was to be applied to all companies, also to companies that were not viable, and therefore The COVID-19 has changed everything because some companies should have been liquidated instead of getting public aid. I always remember the concept of zombie companies, companies that are not feasible anymore, companies that get public aid, public funding, and they just don't disappear, but they should, because they're not sustainable. So you can work with such companies, providing credit, but when a zombie bites a man who is alive, in the end, both of them turn into zombies. And I don't know if we have been able to convey the right message to entrepreneurs. You can delay your duty to go bankrupt. There are gaps in our laws, in our company law right now, especially in terms of the moratorium that has been applied due to the COVID-19 crisis. If we follow this line of thought, we can say that institutes should be there in order to avoid to go bankrupt. We will reach agreements in time, but if we don't reach an agreement, then we will have to liquidate the company. And the European directive that Cesar mentioned considers company restructuring. We talked about that at the beginning, ways of restructuring companies, but debt can also be restructured. And in order to restructure debt, a good mechanism is the second chance law. This law has not been applied properly in the Spanish legal system. Adjustments have to be made in order to align Spanish law to the directive. The aim of this law is that if a debtor acts in good faith, they can have a second chance. So, when there is an insolvency situation, which is not the entrepreneur's fault, then the entrepreneur should have a second chance and not pay the debt anymore. It has to be an exceptional circumstance, of course. Our law comes from Roman law, and of course, debtors have to pay their own debts with their current and future goods. We had a judge who drafted a report talking about Sisyphus from the mythology. Someone had to carry a big stone up a mountain, and every time the stone was very close to the top of the mountain summit, it would roll back down. So the situation went on again and again and again. And therefore, the more debt you have as an entrepreneur, the less possibilities you have to be in the market. I'll give you an example. A couple of people who were retired, they had to pay such high interest rates that they just couldn't cope with that. So in order to allow them to become entrepreneurs once again, especially within the R project, they can do it free of debt. So the idea with the second chance law is to cancel that debt so that entrepreneurs can continue to work. Spanish law is not appropriately drafted. What happens with public debt? We've been told by European Union institutions that our law protects the public sector too much. We used to say the income tax agency is made of all of us, so we have to pay taxes. But what happens if a company cannot pay their debt? Well, the company should be able to continue working and have a second chance. And now I will give the floor back to my friend Cesar. Courts are making a different interpretation on how public debt should be paid. According to the European Union directive, the debt could be fully cancelled. But in Spain, our legislation doesn't say so. So now in Spain, people could come from abroad in order to have a better agreement thanks to our legislation. Depending on the court you turn to, you will have to pay your debt or it will be cancelled. It depends on if you are in Bilbao or in Barcelona, for example. So you will have a second chance in order to become an entrepreneur again, depending on the city where you live. So people could have their domicile in some specific cities in order to get specific benefits. When the directive is actually transposed, this situation will be finished. This is important news. How do you tell citizens what they have to do? Well, when they get their ruling, citizens do not understand why the solution applied is different on the basis of the court that handled the situation. Law should be unified, also at a transnational level, because the criteria should be the same in all countries. That's why we are going through a revolution in the field of insolvency. We have the law from 2003 and 2004, which is not enough to solve our problems. The situation is taking place also in other European Union countries. That's why we have a specific directive that has to be transposed. I'm sure that our colleagues on the other side of the Atlantic will be making the same reflections as us. We have regulations with very good intentions. We would talk about limiting privileges. The bankruptcy law establishes that all creditors should be treated equally, as equally as possible. But despite the lawmaker intent in our law, there are too many privileges for some creditors. This happens when you have to pay creditors following due procedure, and the company can be liquidated or can continue to operate. And the idea is that entrepreneurs can access and have a second chance. And here we have a problem because the bankruptcy law established some specific provisions for public debt, but we have new regulations with different provisions, and then we have some rulings from the High Court stating that things could be different and establish differences between public credit and private credit. Spanish judges have mechanisms in order to apply the right interpretation in each case. I think we should turn to the constitutional law. We have a new text on bankruptcy law that should be modified. But, Pedro, you wanted to say something. Yes. Yes.
Now, since we're under the COVID protocol, we just have 5 minutes to finish up. So maybe you can give you some final ideas. I'll finish in 20 seconds. Yeah, you have 5 minutes. You have 5 minutes. But But talking about this issue, things are still at the beginning stages. I think that they still need to be cooked in the oven a little bit longer. The executive or the legislative has to establish this framework. We need legal certainty. The business people and everyone, we're talking about entrepreneurs, we have to give them certainty. When things are going well, opportunities for investment, frameworks that are stable. The scenario today will be the same scenario tomorrow. But also when things are not going well, in health and in disease. So if a company does go into bankruptcy, we have to offer certainty as well. So I think it's up to the legislator now. We simply apply the law, these stable legal frameworks. Just to conclude, a 20-second summary of what we've talked about. You have 5 minutes, says Pedro. First, it's not a dishonor for a business to go poorly. You have your annual accounts, the results, your invoicing, and when the water starts to get hot, you should ask yourself the question if you're going to be able to stop it and why the water is hot. Try to cool it off. If you take all the moratoriums and maybe this was just due to COVID, but certainly my company will refloat. Refloat by itself? Well, it's not going to refloat by itself. Recognize that you're in a pre-bankruptcy stage and you still have time. There are many people that are interested in investing. It's reasonable to believe that investment or divestment might be appropriate. Maybe the problem in my company is financial leverage, or maybe I need to focus the company. It's not a lack of honor. There's no dishonor. Like, we don't have to defend yourself or deny what's happening. You have tools. Restructuring of the company and restructuring of our debt, rescheduling of the debt. Saving companies is saving the economic fabric of the country. So if you do reach bankruptcy, well, then it should be under the best possible conditions. This bankruptcy law should be used as a tool to negotiate with creditors. Maybe right now I can't meet certain debts, but if certain restrictions are lifted and the pandemic ends and things, everyone is vaccinated, then if the company was structurally feasible, then maybe I'll have the necessary results to deal with that debt. And my last message, let's do things on time, not wait until the very end. Well, if you'd let me finish with a dream, I want to talk about a dream coming from the foundation. Just like when we talked about harmonization, fiscal harmonization in the EU, we could create harmonization for situations of crisis, regulatory situations at Latin American level. This dream, until this dream is fulfilled, we could create best practices, standardized best practice that could be standardized to activate in any country in the world, and also use the same tools for these cross-border bankruptcy proceedings in Tarragona, in Bogota. Can they accept these best practices? That's the purpose of the foundation. It's a dream. I know it's a dream. Will we be fulfilled or not? I would love to wake up one morning and find that it was really worth doing. Thanks very much for your attention. It's been a pleasure having my two illustrious colleagues here on the panel speaking with me, Enrique and Cesar. You're invited next year to Madrid Platform 2022, 23, 24, and 25. It's going to be for the next 5 years, and we'll come with this, trying to foster these same ideas. Thanks very much to all three of you, and also for your explanations. Many companies don't end up like the frogs. And we're going to clean the room now, and we'll be back in Madrid Platform for the next meeting. We'll be talking about water at 12 o'clock. Thank you.